Hello there. Thank you very much for joining the latest in the series of webinars by the Environmental Decisions Alliance. My name is Joe Bull. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Kent in the UK, and I'm honoured to be asked to deliver this webinar on behalf of the Environmental Decisions Alliance. The topic I'm going to talk about today is the title of my presentation, which you should be able to see on your screen, which is Decision Time. We're going to need a bigger mitigation hierarchy. So by way of introduction, can I first start by saying that I looked at the EDA website before recording this webinar, and I see that the existing webinars on there are one on the global ITBES assessment by Steve Pulaski, and another on the meaning of life by Hugh Costigan. So it's a lot to live up to. I'm somewhat intimidated, but I'll do my best to stand on the shoulders of those veritable giants. And I'm going to talk about what really my own research focuses on, which is the mitigation hierarchy. So what I'm going to start by doing is talk about the growing global importance of the mitigation hierarchy for conservation. And then what I'm going to go on to do is use a couple of slides to talk about why it might be that the mitigation hierarchy can be seen as a form of decision support. Having had that discussion, I'm then going to go on to talk about the idea of expanding the mitigation hierarchy to global scale, hence the need for a bigger mitigation hierarchy, and talk a bit about how that's relevant in terms of making decisions in a post-2020 biodiversity policy world, and also what I mean relevant for multinational corporations. And finally, I'm going to finish with a summary, and then that will be the end. So, without further ado, why is the mitigation hierarchy important globally? Why is it increasingly important? Well, let's start with a policy perspective. So, the biodiversity offsets are one of the key stages of the mitigation hierarchy, and I'll talk more about the mitigation hierarchy I have in mind in the next slide or two. But one of the most tangible outcomes of the mitigation hierarchy is biodiversity offsets. And so if we look at biodiversity offset policies around the world, we get an inkling for how many are using some form, either implicitly or explicitly, of the mitigation hierarchy for biodiversity impacts of economic development activities. Now, if you look at the map on the slide in front of you, this is taken from GBOP, which is the Global Inventory for Biodiversity Offset Policies, relatively new database launched by the IUCN and is available at the link given in the slide there. And this shows you a map of all the countries that have some kind of policy in place or in development that enables biodiversity offsetting and therefore has some kind of mitigation hierarchy. So the countries that are coloured in green are those that have some kind of biodiversity offset policy or policy that enables biodiversity offsets already in place. The countries that are coloured in blue have those kind of policies in development actively, and the countries that are coloured in yellow are considering developing those kind of policies. So as you can see, much of the world, in terms of land areas certainly, has some kind of policy in place for development which requires biodiversity offsets and thereby has some link to the idea of the mitigation hierarchy for biodiversity impacts. Now, obviously, what's coloured in here is the countries, and there's very little in terms of marine policies, but I would direct you to the paper, a good starting point would be the paper by Nikki Shumway and colleagues in 2018, which looks at how these kind of policies for biodiversity offsets translate to the marine realm. But in any case, the key point is that, as you can see from this policy database, the GBOP, policies worldwide, there's a huge amount of them that are in place for development with some kind of provisions for biodiversity offsets. But what it doesn't tell you about is implementation. And one of the key things for thinking about how influential policies are is how much they're actually implemented on the ground, I guess. And what we did last year, so this map comes from a paper by myself and Niels Stranger at the University of Copenhagen, which just came out last year, in which we tried to find all documented evidence we could of biodiversity offsets being implemented on the ground as a result of those policies in the previous slide. And the map shows increasingly dark shades of green, shows you those countries that have an increasing proportion of their land area taken up by biodiversity offset projects that are underway, if not complete. Those countries coloured in grey are those that have some kind of biodiversity offset policy at the time we did the data analysis or the data collation, but for which we couldn't find any documented evidence of offsets. That's not to say they don't exist, just that we couldn't find it. And the data set that forms the basis for this map is not perfect by any means. It has a number of major limitations which we discuss in the paper. But the point is that, again, you can see how far-reaching these kind of biodiversity offset policies are in terms of outcomes on the ground that influence biodiversity conservation. And again, hopefully this gives an inkling of how increasingly important these policies are, because remember, they haven't been in place that long. So the use of biodiversity offsetting as part of the mitigation higher activities is clearly growing and expanding. And so we'd like to think, or we can imagine that the mitigation hierarchy in general is growing in terms of its its implementation. So to put a bit more meat on the bones in terms of what I mean by the mitigation hierarchy and why it's relevant to a talk about decision support, let's start with this hypothetical example. So let's assume that we have biodiversity, some original state of biodiversity, and that's changing through time. And we're going to start here assuming that we have some baseline level of biodiversity. We're not going to get into the thorny issue of counterfactuals, but there's a lot that's been written on that. We're going to focus on a baseline of biodiversity. And we're imagining that this is a site or potentially a landscape where we've got infrastructure development and biodiversity is declining through time as a result of that infrastructure development. Now, what do we do about it? If we want to do something about it, if we want to halt this loss of biodiversity, what do we do about it? Well, we have options available to us. One class of options would be to try and prevent some of those impacts, by which we mean we prevent any further impacts from occurring. And another set of options that are available to us would be to compensate for some of those impacts, the historical impacts. And that's where we can start to reverse the declining trend in biodiversity loss. Now, these kind of different types of actions are what constitute essentially the mitigation hierarchy, or certainly the one that I and a number of people are used to. And that's this hierarchy of avoidance, minimization, remediation, and offset. Where avoidance and minimization are the kind of actions that relate to preventing loss of biodiversity in the first place, and remediation and offsetting relate to compensating for losses of biodiversity. And we all have different preferences in terms of where you want to fit on that scale, but the point is these are the different kind of categories of action we can take to prevent biodiversity loss. So why is this relevant from the point of view of decisions? Well, whenever you have some kind of mitigation hierarchy in policy, you're going to need to ideally have some kind of objective that you're trying to use that mitigation hierarchy to achieve. Now that's going to be based on net outcomes because you're allowing some kind of compensation for losses of biodiversity. So you're really focused on the net outcomes for biodiversity rather than just the outcomes. So your policy objective might be something like no net loss, net gain, net positive impact. The point is you're saying we want biodiversity as a result of both the losses caused by development and the gains caused by conservation interventions to somehow equate to either a net neutral outcome or a net positive outcome. And in order to achieve that, you think, well, okay, there's a set of different actions available to us under the mitigation hierarchy. So let's think about different options for using that set of actions. And what we can do, and here's an arbitrary set of options, but one option might be to say, okay, we're going to focus entirely on preventing losses in the first place, almost entirely on preventing losses in the first place. And that's that top option there. Green and blue referring to avoidance and minimization measures. So you're trying to prevent biodiversity losses in the first place, for example, by relocating your infrastructure development in your landscape. Another option might be to say, well, we're going to accept those losses. So option two, we're accepting the losses, but we're going to reverse them wherever possible. So we're going to remediate impacts upon habitat, for example, from infrastructure development. And a third option might be entirely different, in which we're saying we're going to minimize losses where we can, but really we're going to be quite heavy in terms of offsetting those losses. So we're going to allow infrastructure development to impact upon habitat condition in our landscape, but we're going to offset by restoring habitat elsewhere, for example. Now those are three arbitrary options, but you can see how you can use the mitigation hierarchy to structure those different options for your sets of actions to meet your overall policy objective. And then once you've got those different sets of actions, then essentially you can start to build in your other factors which help you make the decision. So some of the key factors that might include are the technological feasibility. So for example, with your infrastructure, do you have any technological opportunity to move that elsewhere in the landscape, for example, and therefore avoid rather than having to compensate for biodiversity impacts it causes? What are your stakeholder preferences in the landscape? Are there certain biodiversity features they value over other features? And does that influence your choice of action under the mitigation hierarchy? This might well be driven by legislation, but are there any relevant corporate or government policies that might be voluntary, which might influence the decisions you make in terms of your distribution of actions? Of course, your cost is always going to influence which you think's the best way to go. And now as conservationists, we might like to think that biodiversity offsetting, for example, is going to be much more expensive than avoidance, because we'd like to think that we want to encourage the avoidance of impacts in the first place, but it might not always be the case. And finally, as an example, risks and liabilities. So if you're taking on the liability of restoring habitat because habitat's been lost elsewhere, then what's the risk that that ecological restoration project is going to fail? So you build those factors into your decision, but you can see how these then influence the choice of different options you have under the mitigation hierarchy, and that allows you to develop your biodiversity strategy. So that's what I mean when I talk about the use of the mitigation hierarchy in relation to decision support. It's kind of a tool for allowing us to coherently structure different sets of options for meeting an overall conservation policy objective. So that's all very well. We're talking at this stage about applying that to a specific development project, like a mine, or we're talking about applying it to infrastructure development across a landscape. But what if we go bigger? What if we go global in scale and apply the mitigation hierarchy on the biggest scale possible? Well, that's a set of questions that was asked by Will Arledge and others in the 2018 paper in Bioscience, which is what I'm drawing upon here. And the idea there is that we have globally this hugely wide-ranging set of conservation initiatives which we put in place to try and prevent losses of global biodiversity and reverse them. Now, what would happen if we were to categorize all human impacts on biodiversity, all negative human impacts on the losses side, and use a global mitigation hierarchy to structure all the different conservation interventions that give us positive outcomes for biodiversity on the gain side, and use a global version of the mitigation hierarchy to balance losses against gains? Does that give us any benefits? And this idea of a global mitigation hierarchy, or what increasingly is being called a conservation hierarchy, this is where it's kind of come from. It's this initial paper. Now, the value in that is obviously, I've talked a bit about how you can think about using the mitigation hierarchy as a way of structuring decisions or structuring options to enable decisions to be taken. And if you imagine applying that to all biodiversity conservation interventions worldwide, and you have a kind of conservation objective to try and achieve, then you can use that global mitigation hierarchy or conservation hierarchy to seek to prioritize conservation interventions in line with national and international priorities. But also, because the mitigation hierarchy is by its very nature a quantitative framework, you're balancing losses and gains quantitatively, and because you can then set them all against each other in different optional versions of a set of conservation interventions you're using to achieve an overall conservation goal or objective, then using a conservation hierarchy, using a global version of the mitigation hierarchy, could potentially help promote empirical evaluation of your conservation investments. You know, where are you best investing your conservation efforts worldwide to meet your global conservation objectives? And does that decision hold as you go down through different spatial scales, down from an international level to a national level and down to a regional level and so forth? So I'm not here to tell you that using a global mitigation hierarchy is easy. It's not without challenges, which we'll come on to a bit later. But it's one way in which we can coherently structure all conservation interventions potentially, and use them and use the mitigation hierarchy as a means of helping us make decisions about the best way to use them. To give a little bit more kind of meat on the bones here, I've just pulled this table out of Will Arledge's paper, and what this does is kind of start to categorize a set of existing widespread conservation tools and approaches into different steps in the mitigation hierarchy. So again, the hierarchy here being avoid, minimize, remediate, and offset. And what you can see here is that, for example, avoidance might relate to, let's say, wilderness areas. So we know there are large remaining untouched wildernesses, the last of the wild, as James Watson and colleagues might talk about. And if we're thinking about global conservation objectives and meeting those, then we might seek to put all impacts on wilderness, true wilderness areas, into the avoid category. You don't want to have impacts on those at all. However, there are lots of biodiversity features which are linked to natural resources which we extract. So minimization, an example of that might be sustainable use, where we're trying to reduce wherever possible our impacts upon natural resource stocks, but we're still going to have those impacts, so we still need to extract those natural resources. And that might relate to, for example, commercial fisheries, commercial marine fisheries. Now, it gets interesting when we get onto the remediate step, but for example, we can imagine historical impacts upon a landscape have led to a great impoverishment of biodiversity. And one example of a conservation approach that might fit into the remediate category would be rewilding. If we're rewilding large areas of abandoned agricultural land, that might count as a remediation action on a global scale. And finally, what gets really tricky is thinking about offsets when we're talking about a global mitigation hierarchy, because obviously we only have one planet, but there are certain things you can start to think about as potentially fitting within that offset category. Like, for example, the inadvertent release and consequent unmanaged expansion of invasive species and the removal of those invasive species might count as a kind of an offset at a global scale. So the conservation actions to do that might be offsets. So you can see how you can start to put together all these different conservation interventions and approaches into these 4 different stages of the mitigation hierarchy when you're thinking about it as a global scale. And that might potentially be useful, and then potentially useful in terms of starting to prioritize. So let's look at what's not necessarily a global map here. There's certainly a map at the top of a large chunk of the planet. And what this map shows, if you look down the bottom left of that top box, you can see that it's the human footprint. So this is the human footprint taken particularly from the paper by Oscar Venter and colleagues, where they look at the current human footprint on the landscape in terms of infrastructure, in terms of activities, human economic activities. And the green there is where you've got very low human footprint, so essentially wilderness. And then you've got different categories of human footprint from low, moderate to high. And there are a number of papers that explore that in more detail, but I'm just using it as an example here. So having mapped that, if we're looking at mitigation, if we're looking at a global objective, say in a post-2020 world where we've got some kind of successor to the Aichi targets, and we're thinking about some kind of objective for biodiversity globally, we can start to think about where, at a global scale, we want to put our key conservation interventions, whether they fit more into an avoidance category, so we're thinking about trying to protect those last remnants of wilderness, or more maybe into a remediation category, which is in those yellow boxes there. So we can look at, for example, at Europe and say, well, a lot of Europe historically has had extensive biodiversity loss, so that might be a region where we focus our conservation objectives more upon ecological restoration. And other areas, one of which I've drawn a box around here, is Mongolia, where you kind of got a mixture of wilderness and heavy human footprint, where you might start to think about a combination of minimization measures to minimize further loss. But now these boxes are arbitrary. The point is to show that you could start to think about where you might focus your different types of, where you have slightly different optional strategies for conservation interventions based on the mitigation hierarchy. And we can also use this to kind of think about what happens if we zoom in at spatial scales. So the top box here is a kind of a more international, not quite global, but international scale. If we then zoom in, and it's a purely arbitrary choice, but we zoom into Mongolia, we can see how we categorize our actions at a national scale differently. Even though we've got the same overall global objective, whatever that is, for biodiversity conservation, we could use the mitigation hierarchy to slightly differently categorize the different actions we're taking at national scales. So you can already see there in that bottom box that there are areas within Mongolia which might have a much lower human footprint, so we might be more of a focus for avoidance measures. We can see areas which might be more apt for remediation and ecological restoration. And you can even start to say, well, we could maybe offset conservation activities into other regions to compensate for kind of ongoing losses in Mongolia. Now, I hasten to stress that what I'm not saying here is that in any way that Mongolia should be offsetting its conservation activities into China and Russia. Again, this is a purely arbitrary figure. The point is to show you can start to think about, based on, for example, habitat condition or human footprint, I should be more accurate in saying, you can start to think about how to categorize different actions in different areas and have different strategies in different areas to meet an overall conservation objective, whatever that objective might be. And a lot of this clearly depends on what the objective is that's chosen for kind of a post-2020, post-Aichi target world. So moving on from kind of policy discussions and starting to think a bit more about the private sector, there's been a little bit of interest in saying, well, imagine if this is not just landscapes we're talking about here, and these maps in front of us aren't just not looking at them as policymakers, but we're looking at them as multinational corporations who have a huge role to play potentially in managing losses of biodiversity and achieving gains. So for a multinational corporation active in a lot of these countries, we might say to ourselves, we have an internal corporate objective relating to biodiversity, whether that's a net positive impact on biodiversity or no further loss of biodiversity, whatever that might be. And we might say, okay, we're going to distribute our conservation activities globally based upon where we can achieve the best gains. Again, using a kind of a global mitigation hierarchy. And there's no reason why this approach can work for multinational corporations in principle. And in a similar way, and to how I've just looked at different scales from a policy perspective, we could think about how the mitigation hierarchy might be applicable at different scales of operation for a multinational corporation, whether that's at the scale of the entire corporation or at the scale of countries, or even at regions or local regions within countries. it could also work across different sectors, whether that's, whatever that sector might be, whether it's primary, secondary, so on, industries, and for the different biodiversity impacts, the different types of features impacted by activities for those different sectors. So there's no reason why we can't start doing that. And what this does, both in terms of applying the mitigation hierarchy at these high levels and thinking about global objectives, either for policymakers or for companies that are based on, for example, net loss or net positive impact or net gain, there's some really interesting work going on by Martin Moron and colleagues looking at how that might work, which is yet to be published, but is on the way in the near future. But in any case, if you're a company looking at this, if you're a corporation looking at this, to actually use the mitigation hierarchy to try and achieve the full potential of using the mitigation hierarchy as a tool for decision support and determining which strategies work best to give you the optimum outcome against your conservation objective, would require a number of things, not least having a clearly stated corporate biodiversity objective in the first place, and that's by no means simple, certainly not a clearly stated quantitative biodiversity objective. Secondly, because the mitigation hierarchy, as I say, is quantitative, there needs to be some kind of metric used, and there's a lot of work, a huge amount of work at the moment going into trying to understand the best metrics for use by companies in managing their biodiversity losses and gains. But it's not just a case of picking a metric, as a case of having a structured process to actually determine the most appropriate metric for any one company. And linked to that is data availability. And it's incredible, always amazes me how many large corporations have very little visibility of kind of their impacts. If you look at their broader activities globally. And finally, if this is going to be effective, this use of the mitigation hierarchy at large scales within companies, there has to be some ability for the decisions you make as a result of the application of the mitigation hierarchy globally to materially influence decision-making within the company. To, for example, biodiversity considerations to counterbalance, let's say, cost, for example, in terms of ultimate decision-making. So this is all very much work in progress, this idea of how we apply the mitigation hierarchy at very large scales to companies and corporations. But again, watch this space because there's stuff coming out soon. So I mentioned there are challenges, and of course there are challenges when it comes to using the mitigation hierarchy anywhere, let alone at very large scales. And these, we can build upon those already identified in the literature. So for example, for the mitigation hierarchy in general, technical challenges associated with that have been spelled out, not least in our 2013 paper on biodiversity offsets in theory and practice, where we list a number of the technical challenges to do with, for example, what baseline you're using, what metric you're using, and so forth. But also, there are a really interesting set of social and ethical challenges, for example. When it comes to any kind of conservation objective which involves accepting losses in return for gains, there's going to be huge social and potentially ethical challenges to doing so. And these have been really well explored. A couple of the papers I've put on the slide here explore some of these things really nicely. I mentioned that the idea of having a global mitigation hierarchy in the first place comes from Will Arledge's paper in 2018. And building on some of those previous challenges that are identified, that in that paper, we then look at focusing on some of the kind of the issues that will probably come to the fore even more when taking the mitigation hierarchy application from a local scale or a regional scale up to an international scale. And in particular, that'd be an issue of monitoring and compliance. How do you monitor and track those kind of issues at such large scales? And finally, as ongoing work, which we have in review at the moment, in which we're starting to think about the additional challenges of if this is a good idea, and maybe this is a good idea, it may not be. It'd be interesting to hear how people react to this talk and other presentations on the topic. But if this did go ahead, this idea of applying the mitigation hierarchy internationally, is there sufficient human capacity to actually do so worldwide in terms of people and skills? And is there sufficiently institutional capacity, sufficiently strong institutions to actually deliver this kind of thing? And finally, it comes all the way back to one of the challenges initially identified or collected in our 2013 paper about mitigation hierarchy, this technical challenge of metrics. We're still struggling to develop the right metrics or work out how to identify and isolate the right metrics for use with the mitigation hierarchy. And it becomes particularly problematic when you're starting to look at a scalable mitigation hierarchy. Do you need scalable metrics to go alongside that? So lots of challenges, and I've only touched upon some of them here, but potential challenges to actually using the mitigation hierarchy at very large scales to help support decisions about the best way to meet conservation objectives. Yeah, a lot to explore there, and feel free to flag some of those. So in summary, the mitigation hierarchy is increasingly influential, I believe, in contemporary biodiversity conservation, as you can see by policy development and implementation on the ground. It can potentially, I hope I've given some food for thought here about how potentially it can provide a framework for decision support in terms of how the different strategies we have to mitigate biodiversity impacts. And I've also touched upon the proposals to use the mitigation hierarchy as a framework for categorizing all biodiversity losses and gains globally, and how therefore we can use the mitigation hierarchy as a decision support approach for trying to work out the best way to achieve global conservation objectives. Now, this global mitigation hierarchy or conservation hierarchy is obviously going to be extremely challenging to implement, as any global conservation framework will be, but it could be incredibly useful in guiding conservation policy development, government strategy, and even corporate action. So there's a lot I've covered in that space of time. I hope that's interesting. Thank you very much for listening and making it through to the end if you're still listening at this stage. And I'm not sure how questions work, but I guess I'll find out in due course. So thank you very, very much.